One of the most contentious aspects of Breath of the Wild is its weapon system. I have seen many people complain about the fact that weapons and shields tend to break after just a few minutes of using them in combat, the general criticism here being the annoyance of having to constantly swap out and pick up new gear, and that it doesn't allow for you to get attached to any single weapon. While I can agree that fiddling with the weapons menu mid-combat can be slightly annoying, I believe that the low weapon durability is one of the most important design aspects of Breath of the Wild as a whole. It is what in my eyes structures and balances the game world and gives Breath of the Wild a bunch of advantages over other titles in the genre. And that is what I want to explore in this video. By the way, I wrote this script at least a week before Jim Sterling uploaded his review, so it has nothing to do with that whatsoever. I felt that's important to mention somehow. Anyway, what is one of the biggest differences between Breath of the Wild and many other recent open world games? Certainly the fact that there is no XP system, right? The new Zelda does not feature RPG gimmicks. It has neither talent trees nor leveling up your character. There's some progression in the form of increasing your hearts and armor, but enemies never stop doing tons of damage regardless, and the few abilities you do acquire have long cooldowns, so ultimately Link goes through the entire game with the same set of moves and skills. This difference is important considering that leveling up and skilling your character in open world RPGs is usually how they balance their game world and slowly unlock harder areas for you to visit. So with the absence of an XP system, Nintendo had to create some other way of character progression, and their answer is Breath of the Wild's weapon system. How then do weapons in this game make Link stronger over time? The damage value of every weapon is clearly shown at the bottom of each icon. Weapons tend to break after a certain amount of successful hits or shot arrows, and since Link can only carry a limited amount of weapons at any given point, this puts a definitive cap on the amount of damage Link can deal before running out of weapons to use. This means that you can estimate Link's current damage potential by looking at the entirety of his current gear. The amount of weapons times their damage values times the amount of hits they can deal until they break basically defines Link's current strength. Naturally, this is modified by successful sneak strikes and elixirs that increase your attack, but it works as a rough estimate. Link then gets stronger by increasing his current damage potential, i.e. by replacing older, weaker weapons with newer, stronger ones, and thus gathering a better overall collection. This way, Nintendo can use combat equipment to create fluid character progression in a game in which the main character does not actually gain a lot of significant levels or abilities. I call the character progression fluid because no upgrades aside from hearts and armor are actually permanent, and neither are as important to determine Link's current strength as the damage he can deal with the weapons he is currently carrying. The entire balancing of the game world, what areas and what enemies you can and should take on, is largely defined by your weapon collection. Because even if you can avoid getting hit forever without enough damage potential, you run into the possibility of all your weapons breaking before you've dealt enough damage to an enemy. This design choice, in my eyes, elevates Breath of the Wild over other comparable games for various reasons. First of all, it adds some great decision-making aspects to the game. Since weapon crafting is only a minor feature, your main ways of acquiring them is from defeating enemies or finding chests. This means that getting weapons is inextricably linked with engaging in combat, the same activity that will be the cause of most of your weapons breaking. So in order to keep up your combat strength and thus your character progression, you will need a constant flow of new equipment, which means ideally you want to finish every fight with more and better weapons than you had at the start of it. This influences combat a lot. From visuals alone, you can make the decision if what enemies are carrying is even worth fighting them for. It can also influence your combat strategy, for example, focusing on the enemies with the best equipment first so that you can pick up their weapons and use them to defeat the enemies that are still left. You also have to constantly decide when to use up the durability of your best equipment in order to finish a fight quicker, or if it is currently safe to only use your worst gear and have it go on for longer. This decision making becomes especially relevant against very strong opponents like combat shrines and mini-bosses. They of course stand between you and a spirit orb or the rarest ingredients in the game, but in order to get those rewards you have to take a lot of damage to your equipment. The mini-bosses often carry extremely valuable weapons themselves too, but but only 2 or 3, so if you go in under-equipped, the weapons you get out of the fight might not make up for all the weapons you had to break to actually win it. Personally, I've been immensely enjoying how the low weapon durability brought me to manage and ration my weapon usage. In a way, it reminded me of permanent death games like Darkest Dungeon and Path of Exile, which I played all through last year and already made a video on. They feature a comparable kind of decision making that, just like in Breath of the Wild, comes from an element of scarcity in your equipment and really makes you think about what you're doing. A second advantage of this weapon system is that it heavily encourages exploration and discourages skipping content. This works in conjunction with the first point. When your main ways of keeping the flow of weapons coming stems from looting enemies and chests, you are always starved for more and exploration becomes highly rewarding. This is why it's so enticing to find a group of enemies wielding valuable equipment and maybe also guarding a skull chest. Personally, I also haven't left out a single optional chest in any of the shrines and dungeons, just in the hopes of finding some high damage equipment. Additionally, the weapon durability punishes you for not taking your time and rushing to a faraway objective. Since progressing your character relies on finding more new weapons than you are breaking old ones, you will have to fight weaker enemies and take their weapons first before you can move on to tougher areas, otherwise you might lack the damage it takes to keep up the flow. In open world games with permanent equipment, you might just brute force your way through some tough encounters by spending enough time wearing them down, but in Breath of the Wild a slow and steady approach with a lot of detours is preferable. This hunt for better weapons and equipment certainly drew me into the world and motivated me to explore large chunks of it without any quests guiding me whatsoever, and that is what an open world game should be all about. Right? A third advantage of this weapon system is how it balances out the world and Link with it. As I already stated, the weapon system and thus Link's character progression is fluid. That means Link's damage potential is not continuously growing stronger. When you gathered a bunch of high-end equipment and then go back to questing in a low-level area, you might have an easier time for a while, but there is no influx of strong weapon drops anymore, while you still wear down your good equipment. So in time, depending on how much of your good equipment you want to keep, you will have to start using the weapons that are found in your current area and thus lower your own damage output to that of the surrounding enemies, which in turn makes combat more difficult again. Through the fluid character progression, the game world eventually brings its balance to you and not the other way around. Some would say this is bad design. After all, you want your hero to become increasingly stronger and not weaker at some points, right? I would however argue that Breath of the Wild avoids a few problems here that I have encountered in other similar games. Since Link's strength is bound to his equipment and not whatever his level is at the time, there's not going to be some stat increase or late game ability that trivializes every enemy in the game. Weapons constantly breaking also ensures that you are not going to find or craft some ultimate gear that permanently invalidates 99% of other loot drops. This is an issue I personally run into quite often in open world RPGs and games with RPG elements in general. At some points you just know that the gear you will receive at the end of a quest or some exploration is not going to replace what you're already wearing, and then traveling the world slowly starts losing part of its appeal. So by not giving you some kind of permanent upgrade that breaks every single enemy in the game, and by forcing its balance on you the longer you fight enemies below your current equipment strength, Breath of the Wild can keep the player in check and offer a more long-lasting level of tension. That is of course not to say that there are no balancing issues in the game. If you explore thoroughly and smartly and don't run around in low-level areas, then especially towards the end you can stay somewhat ahead of a lot of enemies. The dungeon bosses in particular, since they have to account for you doing them in any order, just stop being challenging at some point. In the overworld, however, many high-level variants of monsters and some of the mini-bosses in particular seem to never lose their edge, and that is something many games of this kind don't achieve. Breath of the Wild's weapon system creates a motivation. A motivation that even someone like me, someone who usually curses just about every form of weapon durability, can appreciate. It adds a steady incentive to do exploration in a world that is begging to be explored, and it adds survival-esque item management to a series that so far was mostly about dungeons and solving puzzles. So by committing to making almost none of your equipment permanent, Breath of the Wild gains something that I feel many other titles in the genre lack, and in my mind Nintendo has found the right approach for the right game. Bouken, signing out. Well guys, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and I was able to show why, at least for me, the weapon durability in Breath of the Wild was a wonderful feature. And if you want to support me any further, then I appreciate every like and every comment, and also please feel free to, subscribe to my channel and check out some other videos. I have a bunch of stuff there about game analysis and reviews and so on. And I hope to see you on my next video. Until then, bye bye.